what can we really expect about this first ever meeting between the two presidents?
Well, I'm hoping that there's a connection between the two leaders where they feel they can communicate directly. The great advantage of the second term of the Obama administration and the first term of Mr. Xi was the connection they made at the Sunnylands Summit that allowed them to know each other's limits and to be direct in each other's concerns. I think that will be an important achievement. Put aside all of the economic and other announcements that may or may not come. That personal relationship is important, and I think that's partly why they're going to Mar-a-Lago, the private estate of President Trump in Florida, so they can have a relaxed man-to-man kind of get-together over the weekend.
At this point, Mr. Yang, the date has not been announced. The place, it is a thought at the point, but with Secretary of State Mr. Tillerson's visit to China later this week, it seems to more details can be revealed to the public. But do you think the first visit will already becoming personal and will be direct, as Mr. Paul earlier suggested?
Well, much more than the personal connections and get acquainted, simply because the current background of the policy direction of Washington, D.C. is quite uncertain. And so the first ever meeting between the two presidents will decrease the uncertainties and increase the certainties about the bilateral relations. So basically, I think that the meeting will set up a stable framework for the
what kind of framework?
Well, a base to control the differences that has been sharply increased, and base for the continuity of the existing corporations. Based on, for Chinese side, say, the most important achievements since the Trump administration, say, we get the consensus about one China principle. Based on the principle, many things can be controlled, many things can be cooperated.
But I mean, the very basic principle between China and the United States has already been one China policy. That should not be renegotiated and should not be the precondition for any future negotiations. So, Mr. Xu, which give us the question, has the earlier communication, rounds of communications before this visit, actually dealing with some of the very principles that China and U.S. has always abided by, and therefore, is it really going to help with further communication and discussion?
I think further communication is important because even these two countries are having a very entrenched relationship, but to a certain extent, these two countries almost like coexist. So I do think there's a tremendous need for further communication between the two.
High-level communications between China and the U.S. are actually quite frequent. I've talked to even some of those key members coming from the Chinese government that have been having an impact on this recent communication since President Trump comes into power. Let's take a look at what they say.
The two sides are having fruitful communication and realizing exchanges between our presidents and not other levels, and expanding all areas of cooperation. As long as we act on the consensus reached between our presidents, follow the principle of no conflict and confrontation, mutual respect and win-win cooperation, then there's no reason why China and the U.S. cannot become excellent partners.
I think you might have noticed that during the recent phone call between President Xi and President Trump, they agreed to find the opportunity to meet each other at an early date.
And what can we expect about that early day agenda?
Well, if we work hard enough, they could meet earlier.
We keep very close communication between U.S. Treasury and Chinese finance.
At what level? What kind of communication is it?
That's all level in the ministry. So that's for working level. We nearly keep that's 24 hours communication day by day.
Even after President Trump comes into the office?
The campaign period and after transition.
So you have just heard quotes coming from three Chinese officials, Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi, Chinese Ambassador to the United States, Ambassador Cui Tiankai, and also, of course, our Vice Finance Minister, Mr. Zhu Wengyao, all talking about the high-level exchanges between the United States and China, no matter which administration is in power. Mr. Paul, though, what do you think the two countries have in common? I mean, after all, it's the largest and the second largest economies of the world. One is now looking at globalization, not necessarily to its satisfactory. The other has vowed to be the defender and reformer of the existing system.
Well, I think the most important thing is going to be learning to manage the various security dilemmas that we face, the South China Sea, East China Sea, on the Korean Peninsula. This is most critical. But to go on with your question, the differences between the US and China on global economic trends are seemingly pretty profound right now. The Trump administration is going through an internal debate, which is being reported a little bit in the media here, but it's a very intense internal debate. And we may not know what the outcome of the Trump real direction in foreign economic relations will be until we see Trump and Xi meeting in South Florida. The United States is still, the administration is still talking about fair trade. Fair trade can encompass a lot of different policy outcomes. I expect China is going to come prepared to be very cooperative on lots of the bilateral economic issues. But whether that's enough for the ideologues in the Trump administration is an open question.
That is really an interesting question, isn't it, Mr. Xiu? China now has even actively participating in the discussions related to the TPP, an idea the Trump administration throw away once it comes into the power from the early administration. So what kind of system, what kind of rule is China now trying to encourage globally when it comes to trade and economic growth?
Well, on trade, China clearly is showing more interest in TPP, or you may call that TPP light, without the United States. At the same time, China is actually spearheading RCEP, which is actually more comprehensive framework. But I have to tell you, all these trade deals, that takes many years to finish. So that's long term. I think in the near term, I think we need to address this bilateral trade issue between China and the United States. There seems to be one word being mentioned by the US frequently, reciprocal. So that really means I think China has to open up its domestic market in a more meaningful way.
Well, at the same time, Mr. Paul, of course, the bilateral investment treaty has been under discussion for a long time, but that is also a legacy of the earlier administration. Do you think the Trump administration might pick it up in another name? And also, Chinese investment in the United States, we have seen some recent cases, some successful, some with some political difficulties. Even recent case with ZTE seem to also suggest a very different option. So what do you think about the list coming from both sides, trade, economic ties?
Well, there's a lot of discomfort in the European and American trading and investment community with the lack of reciprocity with China. So that, I think, will be a dominant theme in all dealings with European and American leaders going forward. The bilateral investment treaty is probably the best vehicle to address that, although it's not the only vehicle. I think it's too early to say whether the Trump administration will have a positive or a negative view of the bilateral investment treaty. If they have more time to consider, they spend more time on the issue, I think the more likely outcome will be to advance the talks because they do directly suit our interests.
Right.
But whether we do an interest-based analysis or a political analysis is the question.
Well, Mr. Yang, of course, we are looking at some footages of some high-tech companies from China. ZTE paid more than $1 billion as fine to the U.S. side. At least that was the punishment. So, but at this point, we also know Huawei and other tech firms are not being even allowed into the U.S. market for one reason or the other. So when it comes to reciprocal issues, it seems that China also has a list to talk with the United States. Will that be the starting point, or that is likely to be a point in which both sides are likely to be really in heat debate?
Well, yes, that would be very hard. One of the hard issues between the two presidents, the meeting between the two presidents.
What about the others?
And the security and the economic. I think China will be happily accept the one more word, Mr. Xiu and you mentioned, the reciprocal. And when U.S. say reciprocal about trade, and we will say reciprocal about investment, and no American investment meet such a treatment in China. However, we have been treated so quite several, unfair
Right.
cases. So we also have our argument about reciprocal. So that will be very interesting and very hard debates between the two sides at every level, from top and to the working. And the security, I think there could be compromising ground in South China Sea, simply because, number one, U.S. has no any sovereignty claimant in this region. They have no interest in any piece of islands or reefs.
Okay.
And secondly, the core of the disputes lies in the freedom of passage. So that's the issue of rules and the norms. And no fixed rules and the norms existed. So U.S. and China there's a big room for the two big power to negotiate on how to maintain a real freedom of
Okay,
passages.
it's interesting you talk about that, because I'm sure the two presidents, Mr. Paal, will not be able to go into all these details about which island and which reefs, but rather they are going to set a framework with which, or a vision with which, that both sides can take a look at these geopolitical issues, including about the South China Sea. Mr. Paal, that brings us once again back to the very original question, that is, what kind of frameworks, what kinds of vision do you think?
Well, I think the notion of competing with China is very strong in the Trump team coming in. But they also have people on their team who have had years of close cooperation with China in the corporate sector or in government. And I think we have to see a contest between these two settle itself as to how they want to frame the relationship. That's why I think this personal meeting between the two leaders may cut through a lot of the debate, and that the personal relationship may give Trump a greater sense of confidence that we don't have to erect defenses against China in every area. You mentioned earlier Huawei and ZTE. You know, Huawei and ZTE actually have very large shares of the American telecommunications market at the local and state level. And that's why ZTE is paying this big fine, because they don't want to risk that investment. There's a lot more density, complexity to our relationship than can be summarized in these one or two cases where there are denials made.
Right.
I think the leaders need to sit down and say, how can we deepen this woven texture of our relationship?
But of course, Mr. Yang, before I go to Mr. Xiyu about this, the mutual suspicion has always been an issue. Lack of mutual trust, and we've seen this administration before it came in, some rhetoric certainly has not been very helpful before they come into the power. But now, since they come into power, into the White House, they have been quite articulative in terms of what they say and their approach to China. So how should we understand the mixture of before and now, and also the mixture Mr. Paal mentioned? There are those who are hawks towards China. There are those who have been working with China for a long time within the administration. How much do you think this real policy coming from Washington now with the Trump administration actually is an inner fight within themselves before coming to a conclusion with China?
Well, unfortunately, China has no clear idea on how to engage with U.S. simply because the Trump administration remain under the composing their policy towards China. So in many areas, we have to wait and see.
Mr. Xu, of course, when we talk about the principles, win-win, it's not just with trade and economic issues, but also some of the core issues, as they say, for both sides. From your perspective, economist, what kind of vision, what kind of framework is important?
Well, the framework, or you may say, there's two countries in the ideal scenario to have some sort of a grand bargain. I think the grand bargain really means China would make certain effort to deal with this reciprocal issue. And actually, it's in China's best interest to open up certain market, healthcare, pharmaceutical.
The case rate haven't paid you for the lobbying, right? For this
No.
discussion. Okay.
At the same time, of course, U.S. can sell China more high-tech product,
of course,
and allowing more Chinese investment.
This is really reciprocal that we are talking about. That both sides have a win-win situation. Talking about the win-win, it used to be, Mr. Paal. By the way, it was a joke. The jokes aside, earlier, when China and the United States established diplomatic relations, they both have a common, if not enemy, at least not ally, Russia. At the time, USSR. And now, decades later, do the two countries still need a common enemy or a common threat to be dealt with in order to really have this mutual trust?
Well, I think we saw in the last part of the Obama administration that the common threat of terrorism and the common threat of climate change did bring the U.S. and China together.
But it's
it was
changed.
not a state-to-state kind of threat. That's right, not a state-to-state kind of change. Moreover, we've seen while the U.S. in the early 70s, at the beginning of our relationship with China, had a good relationship with Beijing and Moscow, better than Moscow had with Beijing or Beijing with Moscow. That's now changed. Beijing is now in the center point of the triangle. It has a better relationship with Russia and with Washington than Washington and Moscow have with each other. This is quite a subtle and interesting change, but it should not be overinterpreted as suddenly putting the weight of Russia behind China on a lot of issues.
Right.
There are still many, many dividing points between the two, and Russia doesn't cast that much weight these days.
Of course, geopolitically, things have changed so much. The relations among China, Russia, and the United States is totally different from decades ago. But the DPRK issue certainly is a standing crisis or looming crisis.
Yep.
Mr. Yang, you've been working on this at the end of March, likely a report coming from Washington talking about how to deal with worst scenarios, best scenarios, the
Yep.
hard solution, and also soft approach. Can China and U.S. work on this?
Yes, absolutely. Simply because China and U.S. really shared a common ground and shared common goals of the denuclearization. No question about that. The only difference between the two lies in the different approaches. Simply saying, for U.S., all options on the table. For China, all options but military on the table. So we will continue the cooperation with U.S. in peaceful manner to solve this very urgent issue. Say, I believe in the first ever meeting between Trump and President Xi, North Korean nuclear issue will certainly be one of the items.
Yes, indeed. But Mr. Paal, as you may know, the Trump administration has gathered together some people who understand as they see it Asia. But many of those do not necessarily share the same views with you, Mr. Paal, I'm sure. So how sophisticated do you think that plan coming off the Washington at the end of the month likely is going to be, really? And secondly, do you think the two sides with very different positions in the Asia-Pacific region, one is in the neighborhood, the other is very far away, one is trying to continue the friendship still with DPRK, the other is, of course, to have always been enemies. So can the two really work on a common framework?
Well, to answer the second part of your question first, I think we can get to a fairly common framework. I think the points of convergence are increasing and the points of divergence between the U.S. and China are decreasing, as my friend Xiyu has just said. But people's expectations on the first part of your question about the end of March outcomes need to be kept under control. The administration just is not populated with officers, whether they have a point of view which is hawkish or dovish. It's not populated with officers who are able to do the job yet. They're not in their positions to make decisions and make recommendations up the chain of command to the leadership. Moreover, we have a fluid situation in South Korea, and we're not going to have a settlement there until their election is over, and they in turn put a new administration in place. So this is a time when we probably should be looking for excuses to delay action and delay decisions until we have competent authorities fully staffed in all capitals to be able to come up with reasonable outcomes.
Yes. Mr. Xiyu, your words here.
Oh, yeah, that's a genuine concern. I think a lot of people in this part region, they feel the current administration's Asian team may not be as experienced as they should be. And given the complexity in this part of the world and potential flashpoint, so that's indeed a concern.
Before we go, gentlemen, of course, we still do not know the date of the possible meeting. Two sides are dealing with it. But Mr. Yang, what do you think we can expect from Secretary Tillerson's visit to China? After all, this time he's going to visit, as the former Secretary of State, Ms. Clinton did, to visit 3 countries in the same week. Japan, South Korea, and also China. That certainly is an interesting, delicate balance he's trying to keep. Mr. Yang, your expectation here?
Framework, and the difference working on details of the summit and the
All
date.
right.
Yeah.
We'll see that. Mr. Xu, final words, briefly.
I think it's good to see these two countries talk.
Finally.
Yeah.
Yeah. And Mr. Paul.
Well, I'm really very pleased that we're going to have a meeting. This may help us accelerate the outcomes of debates here in Washington so that decisions can be made about personnel and policies going forward, get legislation where
Right.
needed, decisions on foreign policy where necessary.